Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
Everything I'm about to tell you is based on instinct more than hard evidence. I don't have concrete proof that I could hand over to the police and expect them to arrest someone. I don't have security footage, fingerprints, or anything like that. What I do have is a gut feeling that has only gotten stronger over time, and the unsettling part is that I'm not the only person who feels that way. I'm going to tell this from the beginning and include every detail I can remember because I'm honestly at a loss for what to do. The whole situation is disturbing in a way that's difficult to explain. What used to be one of the quietest, safest places I have ever lived has slowly turned into somewhere that makes me uneasy every single day. For a little context, I live in a very remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a handful of houses scattered throughout our little community, but mine, along with 3 others, sits farther west than the rest. We're the last homes before the forest really takes over, so people rarely end up here unless they have a reason to. Most visitors come by car because there's really nowhere else to go beyond our properties. Even then, the houses aren't right next to each other. If I stand at one of my front windows, all I see are trees in every direction. If I really focus through the woods, I can make out parts of my nearest neighbor's roof, but that's about it. It's only a 5-minute walk between our houses though, so despite having plenty of privacy, we've always been close. The 4 households out here naturally look out for each other because, frankly, there isn't anyone else to do it. My neighbors aren't family, but after so many years, they're about as close as friends can be. My wife and I have known them since we were kids. We've celebrated birthdays together, shared dinners, helped each other after storms, and settled into the kind of friendship that happens naturally when people spend years living side by side in a place like this. Whenever one of us goes on vacation, someone else keeps an eye on the house. They feed our 3 cats whenever we're away, and we water their plants or collect their mail when they're traveling. None of it is ever something we have to ask for. It's just the way things have always worked between us. Out here, you depend on the people around you, and over the years they've become people I trusted without ever having to think twice about it. Then, about a year ago, something small happened that didn't seem important at first. One afternoon, I noticed a car parked outside my neighbor's house that I'd never seen before. It didn't immediately strike me as suspicious. Even though they don't have much family nearby, they do have a few old friends who stop by every once in a while. I figured someone had come to spend a couple of days with them, and I didn't think much more about it. After 2 days, though, I started wondering if maybe that wasn't the case. The unfamiliar car was still sitting in exactly the same spot, but both of my neighbors' vehicles were gone. That led me to another explanation. Maybe they'd done one of those home swaps where 2 families trade houses for a vacation. It didn't really seem like something they'd normally do, but everyone tries new things eventually, and it wasn't impossible. As the days went by, though, the situation started feeling stranger. The unfamiliar car never moved. Their own vehicles never came back. Every curtain in the house stayed closed day and night, and no matter what time I happened to look over, I never saw anyone through the windows. No lights, no movement, nothing that suggested someone was actually living there. Then another thought crossed my mind. Maybe they'd simply bought a different car and gotten rid of the old ones. It wasn't a perfect explanation, but it made more sense than anything else I could come up with. Still, after about a week of seeing the exact same thing every day, I decided I was just going to walk over and check on them. Even if they really had gone away or swapped houses with someone, it felt unusual that they hadn't mentioned it to us beforehand. Like I said, that's just how we'd always done things. Not because anyone owed anyone an explanation, but because that's the kind of relationship we'd built over the years. Even so, I reminded myself that they didn't actually owe us anything, and maybe I was overthinking the whole situation. With that in mind, I walked across the trees toward their front porch and knocked on the door. The second time I rang the doorbell, someone finally answered. The moment the door opened, I recognized the woman standing there. About 2 weeks earlier, she and a man had come to my house and asked my wife and me if we had any interest in selling our property. Even back then, the whole interaction had felt a little off. I had told them we weren't interested, that we loved our home, and had no plans to leave. They kept trying to continue the conversation for another minute or two before eventually giving up and walking away. I never got around to mentioning it to my neighbors. I'd been incredibly busy that week with work around my storage barn, and even though the encounter had struck me as unusual, especially out here where random strangers almost never show up, life got in the way, and I eventually stopped thinking about it. Seeing that same woman standing inside my neighbor's house immediately made every alarm bell in my head go off. I asked where my neighbors were, whether everything was okay, and what exactly was going on. The answer she gave me was strange. It sounded like someone who had rehearsed an explanation too many times. Someone adding unnecessary details because they were trying too hard to sound believable, while at the same time carefully avoiding the parts they didn't want to say. According to her, she had approached my neighbors about selling the property. They had accepted almost immediately without any hesitation, finalized everything, and moved away. As she was talking, I couldn't stop looking past her into the house. Everything inside still belonged to my neighbors. Their furniture was exactly where it had always been. The family photos were gone, but almost everything else looked untouched. The front entryway looked exactly the same as it had for years. None of it made any sense. If they had really decided to move, why would they leave behind almost everything they owned? I was so caught off guard that I didn't even know how to respond. I thanked her, turned around, and walked back home. It only takes about 5 minutes to get from their house to mine, and my wife was waiting for me on the porch. I immediately reminded her about the couple who had come asking to buy our house, something she remembered because we'd both thought it was odd at the time, and then I told her everything the woman had just said. My wife immediately shook her head. There was no way our neighbors had decided to sell their home and move away that quickly. Even if they had wanted to leave, they would have needed somewhere to stay while everything was being arranged. More importantly, we'd known each other practically our entire lives. We had looked after each other's homes for years. There wasn't a chance they would disappear without saying a single word to us. Still, there wasn't much we could actually do. My wife tried calling both of them over and over again, but neither phone was turned on. For the next couple of days, we kept trying to come up with reasonable explanations. At one point, we even wondered if maybe they'd simply wanted a fresh start somewhere else and had decided to cut ties with everyone, including us. The problem was that nothing about our relationship suggested that. They were adults, though. If they wanted to sell their house, they had every right to do it. Eventually, with no family members we could contact and no way of finding out where they'd gone, we reluctantly tried to move on. About 2 weeks after all of this started, something happened that brought all those doubts rushing back. My 3 cats are allowed to wander around our yard during the day, but never very far. There are too many predators in these woods, and we've spent years teaching them not to leave the property. One afternoon, Marley completely ignored me for the first time in his life. Normally, if I called his name once, he'd come running. Instead, he kept walking farther and farther toward my neighbor's property. I followed him, calling his name repeatedly, but he wouldn't stop. Eventually, he reached a section of ground that looked like it had been disturbed recently. The dirt had clearly been dug up and filled back in. Marley stood over it, pacing in circles, sniffing the ground over and over again, completely focused on whatever was underneath. I didn't understand why he was acting that way until I looked up and saw the man from the couple walking toward me with a look on his face that immediately made me uncomfortable. He told me I was standing on private property and expected me to leave. I apologized, explained that Marley had wandered over without listening to me, and that I had only come to get him. I also mentioned that my cats had always been very attached to the previous owners because they used to look after them whenever my wife and I went away on vacation or visited family. The cats had spent years wandering back and forth between our properties, so it wasn't unusual for them to head over there. I picked Marley up, apologized again, and walked back home. When I told my wife what had happened, she agreed that something about the freshly disturbed ground and the way Marley had reacted didn't sit right with her either. That was the moment we finally decided we should call the police. Maybe it sounds like an overreaction, but by then there were simply too many things that didn't add up. Our neighbors had vanished without saying goodbye. Complete strangers had somehow moved into their house almost overnight. Nobody could get in touch with them. And now there was freshly dug earth on the property that our cat seemed obsessed with. The response we got from the police was exactly what I was afraid it would be. They told us our neighbors were adults, that if they'd chosen to sell their home and move away, it wasn't any of our business, and that there was no evidence that any crime had taken place. The deputy spent more time lecturing us about wasting police resources than he did listening to what we actually had to say. I won't lie, both my wife and I were furious after that phone call, although neither of us was particularly surprised. The sheriff's office that covers our area is a good distance away, and around here they've earned a reputation for doing as little as possible. Almost nobody likes dealing with them because they rarely take anything seriously unless they're forced to. I don't have anything against law enforcement in general. There are plenty of places where they do an incredible job. But out here, most people avoid calling them altogether and usually handle problems themselves. This time, though, we genuinely felt like we had no other choice. Something genuinely terrible could have happened to them, and we felt like it was our responsibility to report what we'd seen, even if it turned out to be nothing. About 2 days after that incident, I happened to walk past the same area where Marley had stopped. The patch of ground that had been covered over before was now completely open. There was a hole there, and all of the dirt that had been piled on top of it was gone. I can't really explain what I felt in that moment. The only way I can describe it is that every hair on my body stood up. I know some people are probably rolling their eyes hearing me say that, but I'm not someone who talks about instincts or weird feelings. I'm a pretty rational person, so the fact that I had that reaction stuck with me in a way I couldn't ignore. We tried to carry on with our lives, even though neither of us could stop thinking about it or trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Then, a few days later, our other neighbor, the one I mentioned earlier, since there are only 3 houses out here, came back after visiting some family. The first thing he did was come over to our place, asking about the unfamiliar car parked at our neighbor's house. He wanted to know if something had happened to them, or if we knew who had moved in. I invited him inside, and we told him everything that had happened over the previous couple of weeks. Before we'd even finished, he interrupted us and said there was no chance our neighbors would have packed up and left without saying goodbye. Then he told us something that made my stomach drop. He lives alone, unlike my wife and me, and he said that when the same couple had knocked on his door asking if he wanted to sell his house, the whole encounter had felt wrong. After he told them he wasn't interested, he got the unmistakable feeling that they were about to force their way inside. He said both of them shifted their weight forward at almost the same time, like they had already made up their minds. The only reason they didn't was because they suddenly realized he wasn't alone. He had friends visiting that day, and the moment they noticed other people inside the house, they immediately backed off. According to him, it became awkward almost instantly. They tried to play it off, acted like nothing had happened, smiled, apologized for bothering him, and walked away. But he was convinced he'd seen something slip for just a second, enough to know that whatever their real intentions had been, they weren't good. Hearing that was the confirmation we needed that this wasn't all in our heads. I still don't know exactly what happened to our neighbors, and I can't prove that the couple living in their house had anything to do with it. I only know that none of this feels right. The blinds in that house are always shut now. You never see anyone outside unless they're coming or going, and even then, it's rare. To be completely honest, my other neighbor and I have already talked about forcing our way into the house just to make sure there isn't something horrible inside that everyone has missed. The problem is that if we do that, we'll probably end up being the ones in trouble. Worse than that, where we live, homeowners are legally allowed to defend themselves with firearms if someone breaks into their house. So we're stuck. We don't know what happened to our neighbors, but we're both convinced something did. We just have no idea where to go from here, and every day that passes makes it harder to believe we're ever going to find out the truth. I'm not someone who scares easily, never have been. I've lived in a pretty remote part of the Appalachian Mountains my entire life, and I have no plans to leave. I wouldn't say I'm afraid of these mountains, and I'm definitely not one of those people who refuses to go outside after dark or keeps every blind in the house shut because of scary stories. I don't spend much time outside at night, but that's just common sense. There are predators out here, rough terrain, and plenty of reasons to avoid wandering around in the dark if you don't have to. Other than that, I've always been pretty relaxed about living out here. In all the years I've spent in these woods, nothing had ever happened that made me question where I lived or left me shaken. That changed about 2 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what I saw. I was at home one evening, like I usually am. I'd just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room playing PlayStation when I started hearing what sounded like music coming from outside. Even though my house is isolated, there are a handful of neighbors spread out through the woods. So my first thought was that somebody was driving down one of the back roads with their windows down. It seemed a little odd because, out here, blasting music at night isn't exactly the smartest thing you can do. You want to be able to hear what's around you. Still, everyone has their own way of doing things. So I didn't think much of it. I figured somebody was nearby, and that was the end of it. About 30 minutes went by though, and it started getting on my nerves. It was getting late, and the music wasn't exactly quiet anymore. Curiosity finally got the better of me, so I walked over to one of my windows to see if I could spot headlights or even a flashlight moving through the trees. There was nothing. No lights, no vehicle, no movement, nothing at all. That made even less sense, so I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out onto the front porch, and figured I'd walk a little closer to wherever the sound was coming from. My plan was simple. If someone was camped nearby or hanging around the edge of my property, I'd ask them to turn it down. I deal with insomnia, and once I finally get tired enough to sleep, I don't want music keeping me awake. Out here, the sound of the forest is the best white noise you could ask for, and I wanted that back. As I walked toward the tree line, the music kept getting louder. Every few steps, it sounded closer, clearer, almost like I was about to stumble onto whoever was playing it. Eventually, I reached the edge of the woods, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. I still couldn't see a single light or another person anywhere around me, but the music was now incredibly loud. Then it hit me. It wasn't coming from somewhere in front of me. It was coming from above me. The second I looked up, something slammed into the ground right beside me. It made a loud thud, and I jumped back before realizing it was one of those small, portable Bluetooth speakers. Instinctively, I looked higher into the tree, and I don't think anything could have prepared me for what I saw. There was a man crouched on one of the branches, staring straight down at me. I'm completely certain it was a man, but his mouth, I've never seen anything like it. His lips were pulled back, exposing every single tooth, and they weren't normal. They were long, triangular, and sharp, almost like the mouth of a cat when it's hissing before it attacks. I think he even made some kind of sound when our eyes met. I don't know if it was supposed to intimidate me or if it was some kind of laugh, but I didn't stick around long enough to find out. I hadn't bothered bringing my rifle because, until that moment, I hadn't seen any reason to. I turned around and took off running toward the house as fast as I could. A split second later, I heard another heavy thud behind me, like whatever had been up in that tree had jumped down after me. I made it inside, slammed the front door shut, locked everything, and immediately ran to the nearest window to see if whoever it was had followed me. There was nothing. No movement, no flashlight, no sign that anyone had even been there. I just stood there trying to process what I'd seen. As strange as it sounds, I never thought I'd seen some kind of monster. I was convinced I'd just come face to face with a person, someone with some kind of severe condition, modification, or injury affecting their mouth. I still don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal. I called one of my friends almost immediately. I never even considered calling the police. I don't have much faith in law enforcement out here, and I honestly didn't know what I was supposed to tell them. The guy hadn't chased me, hadn't threatened me, and by the time I got inside, he was already gone. I locked the entire house down and eventually forced myself to go to bed, even though I barely slept. About 3 days later, I'm almost certain I saw someone standing among the trees near my house again. This time, I stepped outside with my rifle and yelled that whoever was out there needed to stay off my property or I'd defend myself. A few seconds later, I heard movement deeper in the woods, branches snapping as whoever it was walked away. Since then, I haven't seen anyone else or heard the music again. I still don't know who that man was or what he was doing sitting in a tree outside my house in the middle of the night. All I know is that he was human. I'm not talking about some mythical creature or some supernatural story. He was a man, but I also know that his mouth wasn't normal. Those sharp, oversized teeth are burned into my memory, and I don't think I'll ever forget the way he looked down at me from that tree. I hope he never comes back, but every night since then, I've caught myself listening a little more carefully whenever the woods go quiet.